What you need, yeah. You want money, ego. Money, ego.
Welcome, everybody. Okay, so in the exhibition, Incarnations, African Art as Philosophy, artist Kendell Geers and collector Sindika Dokolo want to supply visitors with a new way to look at African art. By presenting classic and contemporary African art together in dialogue, their hope is that an Afrocentric perspective can be brought to the way in which we look at African art. But what is an Afrocentric perspective? How do we understand better African art by bringing that Afrocentric view into the way in which we're looking at the art? And what is African art anyway? Why are we putting the African in front of the art? So good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to those that are joining us on social. My name is Adenike Cosgrove. I am founder of ԻΜỌ DÁRA, and I'm joined today in this panel discussion by Kendell Geers and Ugochukwu-Smooth Nzewi. Did I get that right? And close enough. And he is the curator of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Now, the subtitle for this discussion is Decentralizing Curatorial Practices and Bringing in Audience Engagement. So we want this to be very interactive. If you have any questions at all during the discussion, please put your hand up. We'll bring a microphone to you. If you have any questions on social media, type in those questions and we'll address them. And if you're a little bit shy, but you have a really burning question, we're handing out pieces of paper as well, so you can write those questions down, bring it to the front, and we'll make sure to address those questions. And so with that, let us start with introductions. So Smooth, why don't you kick us off? Can you please give us a brief introduction into your career? And really, as you're thinking of that introduction, some might ask, what is a Black African man who is promoting this Afrocentric perspective to art doing curating at a global institution like MOMA?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So the question is, two questions. I see two questions. First, what led me to MOMA? And what am I doing at MOMA, in a sense? So I trained as an artist at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka in the late 90s. And after my training, I was making art and also exhibiting art with other artists who, in Nigeria back then, who couldn't, because there were no curators, basically. And in the course of making exhibitions in Nigeria, I began to think seriously about what it means to be an artist who works at the international stage, what it means to be a curator from Africa who wants to be heard. But I was also concerned with what I called at that time the politics of inclusion and exclusion as it related to African artists from Africa, artists of African descent who were living and working in Africa, but wanted to have a visibility as their colleagues from elsewhere. So these were some of the burning questions for me in the very beginning, which led me towards the curatorial path down the line. And I was, at that time, fascinated by what I called, by the emerging art biennials in Africa. So for example, the Dakar Biennale is often seen as the biennial in Africa. It's a biennial that makes the case that it promotes, it discovers, promotes, and launches the careers of African artists onto the international stage. And so whenever there's a Dakar biennial, you have tons of international visitors coming to Senegal for that reason. On the other hand, I was involved with what we call this Africa Heritage Biennial in Nigeria, a tiny biennial organized by this group of artists who I was affiliated with and was working with at that time. And no matter what we did, we could never get international attention for this biennial, you know. And so in the very beginning, my burning question was how does an artist or a curator or an art event in Africa get to be seen at the international level? And of course, there's always a question of the economics around visibility, which is something we don't very often talk about very well, which I think hampered that biennial that we were working on in Nigeria. But there's also the question of state interest, which is the case with the Dakar Biennale, because it's a biennial supported and promoted by the government. So I was interested in what makes one visible and the other one not invisible. So that was at the very beginning. And so that led me to deciding to find a career as a curator. I trained traditionally as an art historian in the United States, and my first job as a curator in the United States was at a teaching museum, the Hood Museum of Dartmouth College. And there, I was more invested in trying as much as possible to opening up the space for artists from Africa, you know. And so when you go to Dartmouth, when they think about global contemporary, at the Dartmouth College's Hood Museum of Art, what they think of as global contemporary is artists from Africa's work in that collection. And from the Hood, I went to the Cleveland Museum of Art, and from the Cleveland Museum of Art, I'm now currently at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. So, why is a black curator at MoMA? To begin with, MoMA describes itself as a global institution. MoMA is the first museum that invested in the story of modern art when other institutions were more encyclopedic. But in the very beginning, the first exhibition of African art, what some would call the classical canon, meaning the other kind of art that is in Incarnations, the classical tradition. The first exhibition of African art in the United States was actually done at MoMA, Negro Art of 1935. So if you want to think about a museum in the United States that first centered African art, I bet the historical tradition, it was actually the Museum of Modern Art. And in the mid-century, MoMA was invested in collecting modern arts in a global context. And so Alfred Barr, who was the first director of MoMA, visited what was then called Southern Rhodesia. He visited Dakar, he traveled around Africa, he collected Ibrahim El Salahi when El Salahi was visiting New York in the 60s. So there was that push in mid-century to collect globally. But the question is, what then happened after the... It kind of
stopped.
It stopped,
There was a period of quiet where we didn't really hear about Africa.
Yes, so the 60s was that golden age, because there was that sense of renaissance in Africa with independence and all of that. And so internationally, people were invested in the new. And Africa was a kind of new. And MoMA was part of that conversation. Then in the 70s, things went south, you know, across board. And so, things went north, if we want to go that way, you know. In the 70s, into the 80s, and I think that was really where the challenges of nation building began to be felt, not only in Africa, but even in Latin America and in Asia, where countries that have obtained independence began to do the actual heavy lifting of nation building. And at that time, I often make the argument that the Cold War had a role to play in the way in which modernism in the non-Western context began to disappear from the conversations of international art, you know, because there was this two blocks. Either you were part of that or you were part of the other one, you know.
So Smooth.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to you.
Yes, I want to say.
Why are you at MOMA?
Yes, yes, I'll get to that. And so that was what happened. Yes. And MOMA finally decided they wanted to return to its roots. The root being that the global is very important. You know, the new MOMA, as it describes itself today, wants to tell a more decentered story. They want to tell a more all-encompassing story about art in its global ramifications. And part of doing that is to return attention to narratives that have, over the years, been excised from the conversations of global modern and contemporary art, and they began to look for curators who can help expand.
Who can help fill the gaps?
Help expand, I prefer that term, as opposed to fill in the gap. Help expand the conversation to truly center MOMA as a global institution. That's why I'm at MOMA.
Okay, thank you. And Kendell, who are you? No, but again, I'm asking very direct questions here, but as a white South African man, who some people would consider in a position of power, right, because of the whiteness and because of the maleness, working with an established collector in putting together this exhibition, what was your role in that? And I guess, how are you feeling coming into this exhibition and building Incarnation?
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here on this very distinguished panel of two people who I respect deeply. And you might even ask the question, what is an artist doing in the first place, curating? And indeed, my journeys from the beginning into curating pretty much follow the same impulse as Smooth, as being an artist, seeing exhibitions, but not seeing the exhibitions I would like to see, feeling invisible, feeling that the artists whose work I respected is invisible. So I started to make shows in order to try and show the things I would like to see. I started to curate the shows that I wished I could see. But first and foremost, I'm an artist. And I approached this question of being an artist from a very humble point of view, in the sense that, for instance, the end of your question is, you know, the dialogue with a distinguished collector is a friendship. It's really about a collector and an artist, and two human beings who connect on a human level, having discussions about what African art might be. And we pass the ball around. I challenge him, he challenges me. And in this way, it's a bit like, you know, having a dinner. And, you know, and a good dinner is definitely at least a 3-course meal with a lot of wine and laughter and jokes and also serious discussion. And so the exhibition comes together really not as me curating, but me working with Sindika in dialogue, discussion, trying to also share that discussion with friends, artists. And that's what's really important, is that, you know, Sindika might be a distinguished collector, but he doesn't invest in works of art in the idea of the market. Perhaps we'll come to that later. The market being, you buy a work of art, you hold on to it, and then you sell it. You make an investment in an object. Sindika invests in art and in artists. And it's a long-term investment in trying to support languages, trying to support the way that one might be almost in a Renaissance idea of a patron, a philanthropist, in order to nurture a language by supporting things that are not getting the support because things went the wrong way. And the kinds of art that he might be interested in, or the kinds of art that I might be interested in, is not getting the support of MOMA, not getting the support of the Basel Art Fair, not getting the official support. So somebody has to step in and take care of that in order to build the language and the tradition. Now, the question of being a white man, obviously today is a very, very important question. And I think Trump has done a lot in order to elevate the crisis of whiteness and maleness.
He mentioned it first.
And the thing is, okay, let's first say, I mean, at its most basic, my family has been in Africa for 300 years. At what point do you become African? At what point do you earn the right to say, I'm an African? Now, I'm Afrikaans. And I've been called out. People have accused me of being a boer. If that's the word you want to use in a pejorative way, I'm a South African, I'm an Afrikaans working class person rooted in the African soil, culture, and heritage. Now, the best way to explain, so the idea of, now, I will not deny that whiteness and maleness provide certain forms of authority, provide certain degrees of power and respect. I mean, a lot of what the exhibition is about is trying to address how we define our ideas of beauty, our ideas of aesthetics, our ideas of power. So, you know, the idea of the Black Panthers is right at the beginning of the exhibition for good reason, in order to address our constructions of the stereotypes of power. So, you know, I mean, and I say when I do the tour of the exhibition, how come it's taken from the 1969, late 60s Black Panther political movement to get to 2018 before Black Panthers becomes the first black superhero? Why is every superhero a white male, and now we have white woman and a black superhero? I mean, so I understand the power relations implicit. Now, how might I address that as a white man without feeling, I mean, I certainly feel guilty, but at the same time, I don't want to be decimated by that guilt. I want to be proactive and engaged and actually make a difference. And the best way I could explain it is, you know, African people like to tell stories. So I'll tell you a story, which is about where I come from, which is South Africa. And right now, in South Africa, in the last weeks, I wrote a text that literally had me weeping every time I tried to write it. The tears were rolling. And if I start crying now, I'm sorry. But it is because right now in South Africa, there's a genocide taking place. In the sense, there's a war against women. Women are being raped and murdered daily. The statistics are beyond, more people are murdered in South Africa every single year than were executed in Dachau and Buchenwald together during the entire Nazi era. More women are raped in South Africa than anywhere else in the world. And it's not in the news. What's in the news is the xenophobia. The reason why xenophobia is in the news is because it doesn't happen every day. The rape and murder is not in the news because it happens every day, every single day. Now, why do I speak about this? I speak about this because on social media, I saw this hashtag, men are trash. And I want you to know, what does that mean? Men are trash. And you look it up on social media and it says, goes against community guidelines. So you can't even see. The violence is so intense that is actually forbidden. And of course, my first impulse was, not me. Men are trash, but not me. I'm not that kind of man because I'm not sexist. And I did research into why women are saying men are trash. And what they're saying is that, wait a minute, we need to draw attention to this atrocity, this crime against humanity being taken place. And men are trash because every man who looks the other way becomes complicit. Now, the equivalent would be during Nazi Germany, and I don't like to go there, but it does make the point. Not every German was a Nazi, correct. But when you looked the other way, when atrocities were taking place, you were complicit. So this idea of men are trash means you have to make your voice known. Take your position of power and do something about it. Why is it that only women are protesting the sex crimes in South Africa? Why is it only women who are going out on the streets talking about rape when men should be doing it as well? So in that way, it's about, okay, if you have power, use your power to create a voice. And the thing that is vital through the whole exhibition, from the very first work to the very last work, is and in my opening speech for the press conference for the exhibition, I spoke about the right to speak. Now, this is very important. I will not speak on behalf of anybody other than myself, because it's only me that I know, and I can speak about my struggle, and I can speak about what it is to be a white male. I cannot speak on behalf of somebody else, because the second I do that, I'm saying they can't speak for themselves. Then, in that way, I'm saying you're not my equal. And what's really important is the whole idea of this exhibition was to put it out there so that the works, the artists, the discourse, the subjects need a voice to be able to speak.
So that's an interesting point. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're starting to get into the next question that we have, which is about nomenclature and definitions, right? You started talking about historical and classic and what we're calling the older pieces and community. So when we think about, Afrocentric view of African art, for those that might not really understand where we're coming from there, what exactly do we mean by having that Afrocentric view on the way in which we're engaging with the art?
Shall I go first and then pass it to both?
It's your show, so you start.
Right. So I will be quick on this one, because I can use a very beautiful anecdote, which is go and see the exhibition. And when you arrive in the exhibition in the very first room, when you see the very first masks. Now, let's say Africa, there's beadwork, there's all kinds of, there's fabrics, there's figures, there's masks, there's many things, not only masks. But when you encounter your two first masks on the exhibition, they're two beautiful kitwe masks, and you see the one is facing you, and the other one is facing away from you. And this makes the point about when we look at the mask, the Afrocentric point of view is the back of the mask, not the front of the mask, because the mask is made to be worn, it's made to be danced, it's meant to be performed. It's not meant to be put into a vitrine for people to look at. And the Eurocentric point of view is to look at it in terms of its line, shape, form, and color.
I like approaching the question through the visuals. I think it makes a lot of sense. But I think, to put it in very stark terms, there is the Eurocentric position of how we consume the world, how we present ourselves in the world. And very often than not, our understanding of the world, even back in Africa, due to the accident of colonialism, has been through the lens provided by Europe. And so even the consumption of African art has always been through the way in which Africa was discovered by Europe. So if you think about, in the very beginning, what was the interest of African art in the historical, interest of the West in the historical traditions of African art? It was more focused on what one might call formalism, the aesthetics of the object. And the aesthetics was driven by the market. The aesthetic led to the discovery of the market. And we can talk about about Picasso and the others who happened upon African masks in Trocadero, and that gave rise to Western art from the 20s onward. But the real individuals that played a role in the way African art was invented and presented to the world were dealers at the turn of the 20th century who were more interested in the form, And so you have that approach, which is a typical Eurocentric approach to African art, and then subsequently you have the academic approach to African art, which was really to focus on the function of the object. What I like with the exhibition is the way this exhibition destabilizes both the academic approach, which is more focused on the function, and the market-driven approach, which was focused initially on a formalist engagement with the object and the way in which they interacted with their understanding of Africa as a place. So that's what I find interesting about the exhibition. But I'm going to ask a question to Kendell, because that was a question that came to me yesterday when we were having the walkthrough. You describe, especially with the historical canon, because we're trying to identify what the Afrocentric position would be. One would say it's Africa's response to its art might be the Afrocentric position. I think that's the position you want to take with the show. Although you also make the claim that you can speak for yourself without aiming to speak for Africa. But one of the things you said yesterday that struck me as interesting, but also very challenging, was when you describe the understanding of the objects. Now, what makes the objects African art is the embodied spirit that the objects take on. I'm interested in that embodied spirit. Interested in the sense that we often discuss Africa with that sense of ritual. I mean, you hinted at all of that, ritual, dance, and all whatnot, as the definitive character of African art. But I also find it very challenging that one can discuss historical African art without thinking about some of those stereotypes that you would want to mention, without thinking about rhythm, for example, without thinking about motion, for example, without even thinking about ritual. And so when you said embodied spirits, it posits the idea that for the object to be object, that something supernatural should reside in the object. Why so?
How long do you have? That's a very long question that I will just touch the tip of the iceberg of. Because interesting, when you speak about, when you're speaking about African art, you are speaking about the moment when it leaves Africa. You're not actually speaking about the moment when it was still in Africa. And that's also very important. The Afrocentric point of view is to go back to the moment before it leaves Africa, when it was still an object let's not also generalize. There's everything from beadwork to masks to rituals, but within the context of the people who made those things, there's very different understandings of it than once it leaves the continent. And once it leaves the continent, then it acquires value by the names of the people who owned it. Now, you brought up earlier the Cold War. Now, what's also interesting is one of the points of the exhibition is to relocate Africa as an equal continent on the other side of the Mediterranean as part of the global dialogue, exchange of ideas and everything. And just in terms of the Cold War, in terms of my own personal experience, apartheid is legislated in 1948 and it ends in 1990. Interesting coincidence. The Cold War was playing out in Africa as well. But what was interesting is that when we were talking about, how did you say it? You talk about the Cold War and modernism. Now, the fascinating thing about the Cold War, which I'll bring to bear on this discussion about African art as philosophy, is during the Cold War, Frantz Fanon came up with this idea of the Third World. And the Third World was, at that time, not pejorative economic disenfranchisement, but it was, there's the capitalists, there's the communists, and he was the idea of the non-aligned movement, which would be, we take the third position, which can take what we want from both the capitalists and the communists, and develop our own kind of politics. And in a way, my idea of African art, in terms of this idea of embodiment, is Africa is connected to the rest of the world, in the sense that if you read the catalog and you look at the history, the Congo kingdom was Christian since 1491. That has an effect on the way people think. There is dialogue and exchange. The Christianity would have seeped into the rituals, the beliefs, the faiths, the way people conducted their lives, and the things that even if they were rejecting it or even if they were accepting it, it had an influence. And I think that would have been throughout Africa, because even, we imagine colonialism starts at the end of the 18th century. No, it goes way back, and it goes even to pre-colonial times. There was always exchange. Now, how might these things evolve in a syncretic way? And what is important was the exhibition does take its cue from the discussion from Suleiman Bachediadni in his book African Art as Philosophy, where he speaks about this idea of emotion and embodiment and spirit. And one of the things that for me is very important about this exhibition is that the reason why MoMA, and I'm sorry to be cynical here, but I think the reason why MoMA needs to open their doors is because the European, the Occidental art market as we understand it has been purged. Purged in the sense that the White Cube Gallery, for those of you who don't know, was invented in 1954 by Marcel Duchamp at an exhibition at Sidney Jalin's Gallery in New York. And what happened was Duchamp made his found objects, his ready-mades in 1917, and he tried to exhibit them and nobody ever noticed them. They were just basically invisible. And he had to find a way to make the object visible. So he invented the White Cube Gallery, and then the object became visible. And in that moment, a purging began, because up until that point, you think about the abstract expressionists, you think about the whole modernist movement, there was a spiritual concern, and art is very connected to spirituality. From 1954, from the White Cube, the purging happens to the extent that not only does color get purged, emotion gets purged, movement, sound, everything gets purged to the point that there's nothing left. And the last thing to be purged is content. And the only thing left now is empty signifiers on walls being sold for no other reason than they're empty signifiers. And so let me just finish.
Sure,
and so this is, and what the challenge and the beauty of looking at classic African art is, I don't have to tell you there's a spirit there, because you can see it for yourself. And that is inspiring. And this is my protest as well.
So just to build on that, however, you walk through the exhibition, you look at the artworks, the contemporary, the classic artworks. The classic pieces are in technically a white cube. They're in a white box, they've got lighting, they're behind glass.
It's a very small white cube.
But it's still a white cube.
No, it's not. There's mirrors there, and no, it's not a white
however,
cube.
they're in a white cube. They're not danced. The masks, they're not in a masquerade, they're not danced, there's no music, there's no engagement.
There is music.
There is music in some of the rooms. But in terms of the classic pieces themselves, they're not actually being danced in a masquerade. So I guess the question then becomes, how do you think African art should be exhibited or can be exhibited to express that spirit that you say an Afrocentric perspective needs to bring when you're viewing that art?
I think when I hear spirit, I do find that very challenging, I'll be honest. But I think of spirit in the sense of Geist, in a very German sense, of vital force, which is a word I've used, because I also run away from emotions, because emotions suggest the very famous Senghorian idea that emotion is to Africa, its reason is to Greek, which again reduces the way Africa interacts with the world around them through objects, So what it does is it condenses the way Africa makes sense of the supernatural to those objects. The objects are they serve as a conduit through which people make sense of the world they live in. So I don't necessarily think the object in themselves contains that sort of spirit. It's a way of understanding the unknowable, And so in an exhibition like that, it's important to understand the objects as containers in that sense, but not bearing spirits. Because once you make the case that they're embodied spirits, and then you make the case that that the reality of the spirit is when it was in Africa, and outside of Africa, spirits don't exactly travel. Once it's out of that original context, the spirit do not travel with the object. So what it means is that the objects in themselves are containers through which people make sense of their world. And it does not, in the absence of Africa, outside of Africa, it doesn't necessarily reduce the way in which those objects allow people to continue to make sense of their world. So in that exhibition, in interacting with contemporary works, the objects still serve that function ab initio of people still trying to make sense of their world. But they do not imbibe the vital force, because that vital force, or the Geist, I think, requires the community to make it to be active, which is a case I've made in the past. So objects in the original context needed to be danced.
But aren't we the new community?
Are we the community? Well, of course we're the community. So in that sense, there's a different kind of strategy ongoing with the objects in that exhibition, and Kendell becomes sort of the activator of a different kind of dance, But the idea of spirit is something I still struggle with, because it like I said, it reduces the African experience to very basic tropes, It's either you think about ritual, you think about sexuality. These are tropes you find being regurgitated about African objects, and so the concept of engaging with reality in its abstractions are often not part of the conversation when we talk about African art. And I think these are some of the considerations that are at play or went into play when those objects were conceived in the historical past. And if we want to think about African art as philosophy, we should be able to engage with the way in which people think about reality in all its abstraction, which we don't consider when we talk about African art.
Speaking about spirit is very complicated, because if we don't agree on the existence of spirit, we're never going to be able to agree. But it is interesting that for the people from the Congo Basin, the word Inkisi referred to the object and the spirit, and they didn't make this distinction. And I do believe if the spirit was correctly embodied, it would travel with the object. Now okay. I would like to now tell another story, okay? Another anecdote, being that I remember there was an artist of my generation whose name I need not mention, whose work I absolutely loved. And everybody I knew absolutely loved this artist. And it was like, it was the champion, it was the superhero of our generation. And it was, somebody coming from the margins, so it was really the correct champion. And I remember loving this artist's work for many, many, many years, and I'd seen his work for, and I always loved it. And at some point, I went to see a retrospective of his at in a museum in Paris, and I remember walking through the exhibition and feeling a loss, a deep sense of loss. I looked at works that I had always loved, and they were dead. I looked at works I'd always loved, and I didn't understand it. And then everybody else who I was talking to was having the same comments. It's like, I don't know what changed. The works I used to love, I just don't love them anymore. And it was at that moment that I understood something very important, that in fact, works of art have a lifespan. They have an energy, they have a spirit. And if the artist can conjure a very powerful spirit like the caves of Lascaux, that spirit can survive for 19,000 years. Other artists, and we know from the 1960s, we can see in the 1960s the superheroes on the front pages of the magazines, and you look at the work now and it's dead. So you don't have to necessarily speak of spirit in terms of some kind of supernatural being, but it's an energy, it's a life force, it's a vitality. And once I started to understand that, wait a minute, works of art die. And if works of art can die, therefore there must be a spirit embedded and embodied. And the great thing is, when I look at a lot of the classic works here, they're very much alive. And then that becomes the challenge. And so yes, we can't dance the mask because they're fragile, they're important, and the works will get destroyed. And not only that, it'll be disrespectful to dance the mask in Belgium when they should be danced in, where they come from. But let's also imagine that the dance is not just because we end up very quickly at this pejorative idea of sexualized, eroticized, these kind of primitives, noble savages. I'm not going there at all. I'm speaking about real sophisticated ritual, everything as sophisticated as the Catholic Mass, which is another ritual. And what I'm speaking about is this idea of linking art to your life, to your environment. So art is not something that is put, there's that famous film of Chris Marker where he says, sculptures go to the museum to die. This idea of bringing the museum alive, making the museum a living space where art is part of your community, part of your consciousness, part of your spirituality. And the great example is right now, if you go to London, you go to St. Paul's, it's empty. You walk directly over the bridge to the Tate, and it's full. Why? Because art still has something to charge people with, something to believe in. And if you believe in it, it must be spirit.
Okay, so we've mentioned art. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Actually, yes, a round of applause for that. Oh my gosh. I think this is a good point to pause for a minute and see if there are any questions, because we've gone deep already. So does anyone have any questions at all for Kendell or Smooth? We've got microphones. Any questions at this point? Okay, so we will continue then with what we call a thing. So Sindika, he's mentioned that his collection is not a collection of African art, but it's an African's collection of art. So what is African art? This was a question that I kind of opened with earlier. Why are we calling this African art? Especially as we expand to the contemporary, especially as we think about the today, where does the Africa stop and it just becomes art? Why don't you start, Smooth?
Well, I mean, there are several ways to respond to this question. I think in the 1990s, which was defined by identity politics, a lot of African art, a lot of artists who happen to be Africans, let me say it this way, decided they didn't like the label because the label sort of placed them in a certain category. And they said if their contemporaries from elsewhere were basically described as artists, then they should be described as artists, which is a fair argument. Quite recently, you noticed that the market requires nomenclatures, because that's the way. I mean, the market requires classification in the same way museums also require classifications as a way of understanding peoples and things, and categories are the way the market operates. But you might want to also look at it this way. When people ask the question, is there anything really like African art? I often say that someone like Jeff Koons is an American artist because all his references, in reality, are American pop culture. So he is an American artist. But the question is, why is he never addressed as an American artist. And then again, that's where the market comes into the conversation. Now, you also know that you hardly have the broad category of Asian artists. You have Indian artists, you have Japanese artists, you have Chinese artists, you have British artists, you have German artists. These are categories that are very, very valiant. They exist, You describe Damien Hirst as a British artist. You don't necessarily describe him as a European artist, And that's the challenge that I think is the challenge of African art. I mean, you might want to say it as a throw over from the way in which the field itself was invented ab initio with the historical tradition, where a conglomerate of different of ideas and peoples and cultures were put together and described as African art. You might see that as a carryover from that tradition, that people continue, the market or the discourse continue to treat people or artists with relations to Africa in that way. You can also say, you can also make a post-colonial argument to say that insofar there's the reality of countries in Africa, say Nigeria, say Cameroon, say Sierra Leone and others, that someone who wants to make a decolonizing argument might say, I do not believe in those cartographies, those borders, and so I would rather describe myself, if I want, with the nomenclature of African artists, because that's what I believe in, That might be the colonizing.
As an African artist, how do you feel about that label of African art?
Well, I mean, I'd like to also go back to Jeff Koons and Frank Stella and Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg, these white male artists. They're just the folk artists of a very small island called Manhattan. It just happens to be a very rich and powerful island, but they're just folk artists of a very small community. And there is something that, again, this exhibition addresses, and Sindika spoke about it a lot yesterday, is the process, the crime against humanity called colonialism, disempowered African people and created racial prejudice where African people look in the mirror and they hate what they see. There's a self-loathing to be African. And this self-loathing translates into, if you want to prove that you're not African, you have to walk, talk, and look like a European. You have to show in London, Paris, and New York in order to prove you're not African, which is to say you're second class. And and for me, no. It's why the map of the world is flipped around at the entrance to the exhibition to say, for me to call myself African is a protest, because I'm proud to be African. I don't want to prove to the world why I'm African, because I know I'm African. And I don't want to prove what is the difference between African and European, because as soon as you're saying that, it's a European question. Because every African knows who they are, or should know who they are, so they don't have to prove it. So it's a protest for me, and a celebration of my identity.
So then, where does Africa stop and Black begin, or Diaspora begin, or African-American begin? Do you know what I mean? Because you've...
Are you asking the white guy?
Well, so if we're looking at this from an Afrocentric perspective, right, where do these lines begin and end, or is it just a blur? What is your take on diaspora art or African-American art in the context of this African art definition?
Well, I mean, again, I'll go back to what I said about the market inventing categories, because that's the way. I mean, take for an example, you walk into a grocery store in the United States, and then you decide you want to go buy cereal, and then you can find more than 50 versions of the same cereal, because that's the way the market works, Now, the other question is, if you meet someone from the Katanga province in Congo and say, who are you? He's going to first posit maybe his ethnic group, the area from which he comes from. The last thing that comes to his mind is that he's a black man, because he's in Africa, it doesn't have to be a black man. And if you've read Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, one of the things she said, that she became aware of her blackness when she moved to the United States. Because this is not a conversation she had back in Nigeria. She was just Nigerian, Igbo, whatever it is, And so the conceptualization of blackness in itself becomes something that happens when your body leaves continental Africa, and then you begin to have to weigh yourself against Eurocentric machinations. You know, the way in which Eurocentrism will want to define you in certain ways. That's one conversation. Then even in the American context, blackness in itself is a discourse that sort of allows African Americans to find a space for themselves to exist as a people in the United States, you know, and that becomes a diaspora way of engaging with the realities of being someone of African descent outside of Africa. You know, in Africa, I mean, of course, Fela Kuti will sing about the black man, and when he talks about the black man becomes a philosophical concept to rail against the history of subjugation and dehumanization. And so that's when you posit that. So if you go back to the way in which the concept in itself evolved in the African-American reality is because of what they were faced with. And they have to find a vocabulary that allow themselves to make sense of their reality in the West. And so the concept of the African diaspora, of course, there are two diasporas. There is the diaspora catalyzed by events of the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade. And then there's the more recent diaspora that will include characters like myself and a lot of people in this room, you know. Again, it is a way of referencing the reality of being from somewhere but living elsewhere, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know. And some of this, I mean, artists move in and out of Africa, you know, they embody multiple realities, but diaspora in itself is a category that was invented as a way of processing people's experience as a discourse, as a reality, but also as a discourse. And so are they meaningful in terms of the way we experience art? Yes and no, you know, because artists who make, for example, in the United States, Wange Chimutu, for example, before she moved back to Kenya, some of the work she was making was detailing her experience of living in the United States. It wasn't accounting for living in the United States, but thinking about that experience of being in the United States in relation to the experience of having come from Kenya. You know, so it's the diaspora in that sense is a way of thinking about the two worlds that certain artists inhabit.
You know, the map of Africa as we understand it today was drawn up in 1884 and 1885 in Berlin by 13 European countries and the United States. There was not a single African person present to negotiate the territories being defined. It was Europeans deciding what Africa would be and where the countries would be. And there's the sculpture that was owned by Stanley on the exhibition, and Stanley was there to negotiate the Congo for Belgium at that conference. Now, this is an external imposition, much like when the anthropologists went to Africa and they studied the rituals, but they never bothered to take the names of the people who were dancing or the people who were making the objects because they didn't care. It only became important once it left Africa. And this binary of black and white is a European fantasy. It's a colonial fantasy of divide and rule. So, you know, Africa is a continent of 54 countries, more than 2,000 living languages, which dates back to the origin of the species. How can we reduce that to a color? You know, and then you have the work of, you know, the big black square on the exhibition with all these like hundreds of different colors of black. You know, what's interesting is black has many, many, many different colors. White is either white or off-white. Now, the thing is, how are we going to reduce Africa to something singular, binary, dualistic in terms of skin color? You know, and what was really terrifying is that while we can accept the concept of African Americans, why can't we accept the concept of white Africans?
Let that sink in for a minute. So building on that, one of the debates, because you mentioned, you know, as Africa was being divided, Africans weren't invited to that discussion. And one of the debates that's going on right now is, as we're looking at museums and we're looking at the curators in those museums, there's a clear lack of Africans that are being represented. Yes. More and more it's increasing, such as yourself, Smooth, but there is still that lack, and there's the discussion of we need more Africans. What do you think the African perspective, again, the Afrocentric perspective, brings into that curatorial effort in museums as they're representing African art?
When you say museums, what museums are you talking about?
Well, don't put me on the spot like that.
No,
but like.
So do you mean museums in the Western context? I mean,
Well, museum is a Western construct, right?
So when you say...
And we'll come on to that when we talk about restitution, but when we're looking at some of the Western museums right now, there is a debate that a lot of the curators that are responsible for the African collections are white. And that we need more Africans that can speak to how these pieces were potentially used in the historical context, outside of just the aesthetic view of a piece. So what does that bring into it, being an African? Is that important, or is this just something that's super topical because of restitution?
Well, I mean, a lot of people will shoot me, but anyway, I'm going to say what I'm going to say. I think that knowledge and experience and expertise has less to do with the color of the skin, you know. And when you, and I know, especially in the United States, there's a big push for diversity. But I also make the case that diversity is very important, but diversity shouldn't be done on the basis of tokenism, you know, because we have to diversify, you know, then we have to hire people, we have to find those people. Now the question is that's the other question. If you hire, in my situation, if you hire, like when I was at the Cleveland Museum of Arts, you hire me as someone who's been trained to speak, to understand Africa through a particular lens. Does that give me power, really, to change the conversation? It could be yes, or it could be no. You know, because I was trained in the United States, and my training my understanding of African art has been shaped from an American position. You know, does that mean that being African-born, does it play any role in the way I interpret Africa to an American audience? So when people make a push for diversity in that sense, we need African-born people, which is important, so people don't get me wrong. The question is, do we need them because there's a Western push for African-born curators, or for African curators, or will they be empowered to really change the conversation in ways that people in Africa will recognize themselves in the objects when they come to those museums? And I don't think we've answered that question well enough. You know, I just went over to the Tavern to see
topical now.
The museum over there,
yes.
You know, and then I saw the way the conversation changed from African intermediaries to African experts, you know. But I don't know exactly what that means in the context of the museum, because the language, the colonial language, has not been shedded. It's still very much visible. So, do you invite those voices to satiate the audience, or do you really empower people, changing the structure of the institution in itself to recognize that there are different ways of understanding those objects, and that there's a particular perspective that Africa brings to its object? That should be the question, you know. Will the structure of the internal structure of the museum in itself evolve to allow for deep conversations, or rather than saying, oh, we can't change this object because it's part of the architecture of the museum, where in a sense, the object in itself continues to bear witness to the violence of colonialism?
I mean, would always advocate complexity rather than simplification, especially when it comes to art, because, and I also very often take a question like that and flip it around. So the National Gallery in Cape Town has a very large collection of European art, classic European art. Would you then say the only people allowed to be curators have to be white European descendants? No, of course not. On the other hand, you know, Mondrian was a deeply spiritual person. Could an atheist curator like Smooth curate an exhibition of Mondrian? What did you call it? Non-spiritual.
I don't describe myself as that.
Okay, forgive me.
Anyway.
No, my point being that, do you have to be a spiritual person to curate an exhibition of Mondrian? I think not. But if you are familiar with the spiritual practices of Mondrian, you might be able to access more layers of meaning and be a more sensitive curator and have more empathy for the object. And I think that very often there's a hysteria on the subject of Africa that just doesn't put it into a context and like, wait a minute, if we exchange the object for a European object and then consider it from another point of view, let's go to Cape Town and look at European art, does the same hysteria apply? And then, and that gives it a bigger perspective. And I think definitely right now, there's a need to redress the imbalance of power in Europe and the United States and a lot of these old, these very white, strong countries with very white, strong museum directors and people of power. That needs to be addressed. But I don't think one needs to fall into tokenism and start to look at art from a checklist of criteria, which actually has nothing to do with the ability to empathize with the objects.
So speaking about power, when we talk about the historical pieces specifically, one of the names that comes up over and over and over again is Picasso. Oh, Picasso went to the flea market and he saw these pieces and he felt the spirit, and these objects can exorcise the demons from, and it's almost like we need Picasso to understand African art. Why do we feel the need to mention Picasso? Because yesterday when you were doing the tour, you did mention Picasso as well. Why do we feel the need to mention the modernists when we're talking about the classic pieces of art? Can African art not stand on its own without Picasso?
I think it should. Yeah, I think it should. I think, there's the hysteria about, and I've said this severally, that there's always a reaction to Europe. The Eurocentric position, it's always reactionary, and there's a reason for that, because of a history of intellectual violence, in addition to physical violence. I get that history, but I think that we shouldn't obsess when you want to this, because you think that there's a legitimacy that Picasso conveys on the object when you posit Picasso's name, I don't think that should be the case. I think that what I do in my practice, is to say that the object, first I think of the object as objects of history, because that's something that historical, and that's why I don't use classical. I use historical because there's always a denial of history. The objects are not granted history because they are viewed as ethnographic objects, and so the history they carry with them are not often contextualized. And that's the history of the people, that's the history of the people over centuries, and the way in which their way of seeing the world has changed through those objects. Because no one single, and I'm going to use Penda for example, which is a European construction in that sense, no single Penda mask is the same. What is often denied when people talk about Penda mask, or not just Penda, or even Sonye or Congo objects, is the idea that even the form in itself continued to evolve as people responded to the changes in their reality. Those things are often not contextualized. And I think the emphasis for me, as a scholar of African art, is to understand what changed those objects. And one exhibition that sort of tried to answer that question is the Congo show, which was organized at the Met in 2016, where not all the arguments, I don't agree with all the arguments, but the argument that struck me was the way in which the Nkisi began to grow. Of course, there are various kinds of Nkisi. There's the more personal Nkisi to the communal Nkisi. But you realize that Nkisi began to grow. And it began to grow because the enemy became more potent, more powerful. And so the object had to grow because there's an express belief in the object to ward off danger, to protect from the enemy. And when the enemy began to be seen as more powerful, the object had to grow, had to be bigger to contend with a more powerful enemy. And so when we have those conversations, we don't even look at the object as object. We don't think of the object as bearing in them history, textual history that can be read. And so we miss that point when we begin to obsess with the Eurocentric position on those objects. The objects in themselves carry enough stories that we need to unpack.
Or does Picasso make it accessible to
whom?
A wider audience?
What wider audience?
Picasso certainly makes it accessible to the European people who are familiar with Picasso. And in that way, Picasso is a reference. He's not an unimportant reference. He's not an unimportant artist. But at the same time, one of the issues that I always have taken with African exhibitions that try to link contemporary and classical, link Picasso, is that, you know, the African's always the sideshow. It's a bit like the opening act, but the small opening act. I mean, there was the Picasso primitive at Cape Henley with a big Baga mask. It was one of the worst Baga masks I ever saw. I mean, you could buy better in a flea market. Now, that was sitting at Cape Henley. Okay, Picasso saw that and spoke about the influence, but nothing compared to the Baga mask on the show here. Now, that's the thing, is that when African art is there as the sideshow, as the side act, as the less important thing that Picasso took inspiration from, then it's pejorative. But here, when you see the Pende mask that inspired Les Dames d'Avignon, it doesn't need Picasso. It's better than Picasso. It sits there, it's strong, and it speaks to you directly without the need to loop back to Picasso.
Wow. Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes or so left, and one of the things that I do want to touch on specifically, Kendell, is this, where you've got the Damien Hirst surrounded by incredible masks. Why? Why do we have an Ife head created again by a European artist, by a British artist, surrounded by exceptional pieces of African art?
Well, I mean, I like to call this room my Afro shrine, in a very specific homage to Fela Kuti, who was an artist and an activist, musician, and very vocal about his ideas of identity. And what this Afro shrine upstairs proposes or opens up is this dialogue with histories, that every single object in that room has these strings of history which take them back to context. And those histories are important and need to be spoken about, and every one is individual and okay. We don't go into it in this exhibition, but one can research them. Now, the history of the Damien Hirst is also interesting. First of all, who were the Ife? Why did they make that sculpture in the first place? So the object that's on the exhibition, let's say the original Ife head, passed through the British Museum at some point. A copy was made, a mold was taken. Now this is interesting. This is a European museum making a copy. It's not one of the stolen works from the Benin bronzes. It's not one of the looted works. It passed through the British Museum, a mold was made. It went then to the museum in Nigeria and it was stolen. So now this object is not lost, it's just missing, it's somewhere in the world. I mean, it's obviously being taken care of by whoever stole it. Now this is, and what Damien Hirst did is he made a copy of something that we don't have access to and passed it off as his own. But what's interesting is that when you look at the object, he didn't pay attention to the patina or the detail. He just cast it in a very almost lazy way, because he didn't really understand the idea of how the Ife head could be embodied, compared to what the real Ife heads, how they would be, how they would be made, and the patinas and the edge. The way that room is constructed, you can look through the mask of folly, or the mask of illness, or the Kwele mask. You can look through the eyes at the Damien Hirst, and there's a spot on the mirror floor where there's a missing pedestal, where you're invited to join the discussion. And the idea of that installation is, join the discussion and ask yourself, who has the right to speak for the Ife? Because present-day Nigeria and the historical Ife, is that even a connection? Is that even something that we can speak about? Is it only Nigerians who have the right to speak about Ife? Or is it all Africans? Who has the right to decide what African art is and what it is not? Who has the right to judge African art? Who has the right to say, in South Africa, there's a lot of people who say that Picasso stole African art. Was he stealing or was he quoting? And so that's the idea of this exhibition. And really to sit there and look at how a European artist constructs his fantasy of the market and leans on Africa in order to embody his idea of market, surrounded by ritualized objects that were danced and embodied and extremely evocative. Now, from one point of view, it's the Pende mask that is so powerful. From another point of view, it's the captain of the market, Damien Hirst. And that, and the whole point about the room full of mirrors is it's up for you to decide. The great thing about art is it should not be moralistic. Because as soon as art becomes moralistic, artists lose their contact with that deep-rooted spiritual core. Because spirit can never moralize. And so, take the morality out of it and then engage in the discussion.
What do you think of the Afro Shrine?
I mean, I had this conversation with Kendell where I said, I mean, yesterday he describes, how did you describe him again? Damien Hirst as, what was your word again? I want the exact word.
Don't remember.
You remember, of course. He said, yeah, I want that word because it's very important. You say the word, the way you describe him. A talentless artist, you know, a hack, basically, you know. But he needed a hack in his show, you know. Why would you need a hack in your show? You know,
So we can have this discussion, because without it, because the whole point about art being amoral is that it needs to transcend contradiction. And if I curate an exhibition and only have the work I like, then you're speaking to the converted. It's important to also speak, it's also important to challenge yourself and put works on the exhibition that destabilize your formula.
But isn't it a question of value as well? Because if a visitor, an exhibition visitor is going into this room and they see a Damien Hirst, they almost blur out everything else that's around this Damien Hirst and they zoom in on his Ife head. So isn't it also a question of what we're placing value on, and by having him in the middle of individual, incredible pieces, you're taking away the value of the historical African art?
well, I like to say this. I mean, I want to go back to what we said about Picasso and Africa, where when you don't have any conversation, whenever you start a conversation about Africa made the West, it's mediated through the actions of Picasso and Braque and the others and his friends, you know. And so you can think of this shrine. I mean, that's the other way to think about the shrine, as when you want to focus attention on the shrine, which goes back to the question of value. When you want to focus attention on the shrine, you think about Damien Hirst there. So Damien Hirst becomes a modern Picasso in your show, you know. But to the question about morality, and the idea that art shouldn't lend itself to that. And at the same time, you are inserting Damien Hirst as a way of raising question about morality.
Yes, except you're invited to decide what you think. I'm not telling you what I think. That's the whole point of that installation, is that there is no simple answer there. Some people will see the Damien Hirst as, you know, I'm looking at it here from this angle, it looks like he's about to have his head cut off. From another angle, they could be worshipping him. I mean, you don't know if this is a tribunal or if they're about to devour him in some kind of cannibal ritual. You know, and it's really up to you to decide what do you where do you, because that's, I think, the important thing about politics is if I'm telling you what I think, who I vote for, you're just going to agree with me or disagree with me. So there's no transformation. Nothing changes. However, if I put you in a situation like that, where the fact that we're having this discussion means it's unclear, which means you having these discussions inside your head, which means you challenging your own ideas of aesthetics and politics and value, which means transformation is taking place.
Okay, so let me tell you my first impression when I encountered the installation. From a distance, I saw the Ife head. I said, "How did Sindika get an Ife head?"
And maybe we should also say that buying an original Ife head is illegal. And the original is absolutely illegal for those of you who don't know.
That was from a distance. I saw it. I said, "Am I seeing correctly?" You know. And then I came close, and then it was a Damien Hirst, and then I recalled the controversy at Venice and all of that. You know. But I think.
Can you explain the controversy of Venice?
So Damien basically sort of he took icons from other cultures and made replicas of those icons, and then had that installed at Venice in 2017. And then a Nigerian artist who was exhibiting in the Nigerian pavilion saw the Ife head and then complained that Damien was basically appropriating, that he was always appropriating stuff, and that finally his appropriation has come to Africa. And then it became a contest over who has the right to appropriate what object. So that was a sort of controversy, which ended up serving Damien and not the artist. Hence the reason why you collected the work, because part of it's the controversy. You know, all the works like this, most of the works at Venice ended up being sold or being bought by collectors. You know, so if they
I think we should ask Sindika why he collected rather than assuming.
well, yeah.
Because I was intrigued. And the way I collect, the way we worked on this show with Kendell, like he said, is a friendship, is also trust, is also a path. Like we were like explorers, exploring ourselves, and putting the best way to explore yourself is to put yourself in front of your own contradictions.
Right.
And I felt very uncomfortable with this. The question of him using that, of course I understand, he's smart. He takes his 10-year-old kid and say, do something, like put some paint on this thing, and then he rolls it on a system, and then he sells a series for $1 million. So I understand the provocation and where it's come from and what it's about. But the real idea for me was to say, well, this raises a number of questions. And I said, well, I'm sort of feeling uncomfortable out of my comfort zone, and this is where we make progress. We have to sometimes push ourselves out of the comfort zone. What I love about the installation now, because I wouldn't have shown it. I just wanted to keep it, and I thought, well, I need to think about this, you know, and that's why I wanted to have it, because it raised a number of very, very good questions that made me very uncomfortable with what I'm doing, which question really the sense and the meaning of what it is that I'm doing by, like, all the questions that Adenike, who's brilliantly smart and vicious in her questions, and shots being fired, like with tough questions about Africans, about what it means, African art, does it make sense? Do spirits exist? Are they really alive? What does it mean out of the context, etc., etc.? The thing that I love is the way the poetry. Sometimes you cannot explain. This is a little bit the limit, and always the problems I have with the work, the job of a curator, is that sometimes the whole point of art is not to be explained. It's just to be like a poem. And I thought the idea of using that work in a very poetic, that I find beautiful, because the work of art, this is what I found beautiful. You asked the question about, are we not the public now? Are we not the people? Because you said the community, exactly. Said, are we not the community? I think it's really interesting, because at the end of the day, when I say all these masks are not the artwork. Every single one is a masterpiece. None of them is what I show and I revere as being a masterpiece, because it's really a medium, a tool used for the performance, the masquerade. Nevertheless, in this case, these masterpieces have been put in museum of ethnology. So basically, ethnology being the science of the different, the other, the one that's not me, exotize, sort of make it exotic, okay, and killed the gods that were in them from that perspective. And the fact that now they are characters, the fact that it is an artist, the artwork, exactly like in the masquerade, the mask is a masterpiece, but the art is the installation. I very much like that idea. And I'm very much like the idea that it's poetic, it's beautiful. I mean, when you look at it, it's just beautiful, and it's just powerful. I don't know if the spirits exist. What I know is if we go now and probably the lights are off and we put you there, I'd like you to repeat, spirits don't exist, or they don't exist out of Africa. I mean, you will feel that. It's an experience that
I'll feel an energy.
Yeah, well, yes. But in this sense, exactly the sense that Kendell, and maybe in a way that is a question mark and not a definition, like it doesn't delimit or define what it is. So I like the idea that actually we have found a use for this fake Ife head. And it is a beautiful statement, and I love it as an artwork, as an installation, because it raises a number of questions. Exactly like poetry, instead of ending up with a final dot, it ends up with an infinity of different directions, and it raises this kind, and it's the opportunity actually to create this kind of debate that I find really, I'm having a lot of fun. I want to thank you for it.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, for the sake of time, we can't cover the restitution debate. I mean, we could be here for hours if I ask that question. But just very briefly, Kendell, if you could touch on this section of the exhibition, what is it about? What has the foundation done? And ultimately, how did this Chukwe mask end up in the show?
Well, I mean, there's not much time to go through that, but the long and the short of it is, this is the only room in the exhibition that looks different than the others. And what you have on the walls is basically the records of a museum in Angola, the Dundo Museum, that has been looted. And these objects are out in the world somewhere. And the great thing about art is it doesn't disappear. Somebody is taking care of these objects. And again, as a philanthropist and as a patron, what Sindika is doing is he has a team of people, and Agnes is over there, and she hates it when we say Agnes is over there. So I'll say Agnes is over there. She can stand up. She hates it when I ask her to stand up. And Agnes finds these objects in collections, in auction houses, wherever, finds these objects, and a gentle negotiation takes place in which the works are basically acquired and then eventually returned back to Angola. Now, what's really important is that, I mean, I don't know many people in the world today who are actively actually finding solutions to the question of restitution. There's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of desire, there's a lot of political pressure, there's a lot of lobbying, but Sindika is actually doing it while everybody's talking. And for that, I find it absolutely extraordinary that he's raising the bar to the level of, and in that way, what's really important is both with the collection and with this idea of restitution as a role model for other African people to follow, a role model to be a trailblazer, to actually make a difference proactively, rather than, you know, again, instead of sitting back and begging Europe to give you back your stolen art, you can actually go out there and take Europe by the balls and squeeze them until the work comes back. And that's, you know, in essence, what he's doing is he's challenging the market structure and calling out dealers or collectors who might think it's okay to trade these stolen works of art, even knowing that they're stolen. And the excuses are now running out, and that's really important, because as more and more excuses run out, so we need to start engaging with the demand, and what's really important is when, I mean, I will quote Sindika not as well as he does it himself, but the stolen works of art, like the Queen Eyoba head in the British Museum, this is not a mask. This is not even a spirit. This is the coronation. This is the crown jewels. You know, it was the crown jewels that were stolen during the 1897 punitive raid that's sitting in the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum. This is what creates cultural unity. This is what creates heritage. Now, how dare the British say, on the one hand, well, we're not going to give back your crown jewels, but why don't you have cultural unity? You know, these things are connected, and I think it's very important also to acknowledge that Africa, without its art, it's not about museums, it's about heritage. Without its art, I mean, we can't have an intelligent discussion about what Africa is. And the first step is to know your own history. And the first step of colonialism was to destroy history.
Yes, okay, so I think we have time. We're actually going to open it up to questions now. So there is a question just over there, and we'll go over to that second.
Thank you for this discussion. I know that this notion was used to denigrate the African cultures during the colonization. But I want to ask why we don't we use the notion of a fetish object to express the embodiment of social reality in these art objects at the end? Because a fetish is the incarnation of the reality or in an object. Then I didn't hear this notion, and I wanted to know why.
So I think the question goes back to nomenclature, right? It's called fetish. Why haven't we mentioned fetish? Why haven't we mentioned primitive? Why haven't we mentioned tribal in this discussion?
Well, I think you'll have to respond to the fetish question, because you beautifully discussed it yesterday. Yeah.
I mean, okay, fetish, I mean, if you, in my catalog essay, I mean, you can read that, in fact, the word fetish is coming from the Portuguese word fetichio, which is coming from facere in Latin, and it means to make, the idea of to cast a spell, because the objects were called inkisi. And for the people who made the objects, the inkisi was both the spirit and the object. And when the Portuguese sailors were arriving in that part of Africa, they could not call these objects art, because they were so outside their frame of reference. They invented this word fetichio. Fetichio translates into fetish, and eventually Freud popularizes it. But now here's the problem, is that at its point of origin, it was not pejorative. And the way Freud uses it, it's not pejorative. You know, if we're talking about cultural fetish, in that sense, the whole exhibition is about this idea of art being a witness, art being a social embodiment of a politics, a spirit, a charge, an identity, a gender, a sexual orientation, or whatever. And in that way, we can speak about fetish in the fetishization of processes. However, when we speak about fetish in relation to specifically African art, it conjures up this idea of savagery, primitivism, which now savagery and primitivism from the point of view of Rambo is very positive and something very empowering and something very profound and deep and emancipatory. However, from the colonial point of view, it is very reductive because it's, you know, in the exhibition you see the video of Tracy Moffat where you see black people are reduced to noble savages, eroticized, romanticized, generalized cliche. So they're not humans, they become cliches. And so the reason why I resist this idea of calling those objects fetish is because you're implying a savagery which is a colonial fantasy rather than giving them the respect of the power that they embody.
I will say those who made the objects never called the objects fetish, so why would you call them fetish?
What about primitive and tribal?
It's the same thing.
Same thing.
There was another question there in the corner.
I noticed that when we were talking about the last room in the exhibition, the word installation was used. So my question is, what is the difference between an artist making a large installation and what a curator does?
First of all, I again cannot speak on behalf of curators, but I am an artist who believes in spirit. And when I make an installation, I'm embodying a spirit. And when I create an installation, I'm not thinking in terms of, in a way I'm thinking about the Gesamtkunstwerk, the idea of the sensorial, the full experience with your entire body. But I mean, I'm sure a curator could also have that same thought. I'm not saying that it's unique, but I think that perhaps the way an artist will approach exhibition making, there'd be a different sensitivity to materials because let's be frank. I mean, when you make stuff, and maybe that's what makes you a good curator, because you're rooted in being an artist. Is that? I
don't know if I am a good one.
You are. So artists make stuff, and for that reason, the mythology of making stuff goes out the window. And curators who don't make stuff very often get lost in the mythology of confusing what it is to make stuff. And so they romanticize it and mythologize it. And there's a kind of a rootedness, when I make exhibitions, that is rooted in a deep respect and understanding for artists, above market, sorry Sindika, but I think you would agree, above collectors, above all the functionaries that surround the object. Because, one of the details that is important to remember is that you have your altar, embodying your saint or your Christ. Around the altar, you built your church. Around your church, you have your square. Around the square, you have the village. You put the work of art at the center. And a lot of what happens today in the art system is we forget that art is at the center. And instead we put the collector or the curator at the center.
I would say that curating is very subjective. But then what happens is the curator often thinks he or she takes 2 or 3 steps back. And so you don't, and that it's presenting to you, he or she is presenting to you an objective story, So what you say is the curator hides behind the mask, But the artist allows you to have a visceral reaction to the exhibition, hence the sort of conversation we're having. I would say that when you look at that exhibition, it's in the image and likeness of Kendell, and so you have a visceral response to it, as opposed to begin. So when a curator wants you to think about art history first before you think about the object. When an artist is curating, you want to think about the object first before art history.
And I think we have, one comment.
Actually, I find the question really interesting. Actually, the thing is, my perspective on this is that the function is curator. But Kendell is an artist. So the interesting part is that the thing that he is an artist, he cannot cease to be he could not curate, for instance. But that's the interesting part, is that for me, Incarnations, the way here in Beaux-Arts, is an artwork. And I was talking about the poetry. I think and this is what I said about the whole approach of the initiation in the parcours, because it's the same thing like the mask again. There's the mask, which is the artwork, and then there's the masquerade, that is the artistic proposal. It's the artistic world. And what I like in an artist generally is his capacity to bring us into his world, his capacity to control his vocabulary in this world, and the level of elegance and poetry. This is to me the three aspects that I look at when I look at a work and I decide to work. I don't like to say to buy, but to work with an artist. And this is what I love about this show here, is that this is really Kendell's world. This is his imagination. This is why he stands. Kendell wakes up in the morning, he jumps out of bed and wants to say something. He wants to fight. Everything is so intense. It's so him. So it's interesting because I like to, unfortunately it closes tomorrow, but then it gives you a chance for everybody to go and check it out tomorrow again. When you go and you visit it with Kendell, you visit it with a curator. He will explain things. What I think this show deserves is to listen to the curator, and second, without him when he's not there, or with him silent, to discover the artist, his world, his universe that he's recreated. And I like the idea that finds very often like a decoration. So the red and white with the believe and the lie, it's an artwork. It's everywhere. Just to give you, this reminds me, I'll just share the experience, because you remember when we were in Valencia at IVAM, that was like ages, I think 2005 maybe. So that's already like 15 years ago. So we did this show in IVAM, and everybody was asking, well, where is the African show? Because when they opened the door, there was like videos everywhere. It was very contemporary, miles away from what people would expect an African show would be. And then the two last pieces in the exhibition, so I was going out with I was doing the opening with the lady who's the manager, or how do you call that? The director. The director and it was a group of patrons of the museum, so all Spanish, so very Catholic, and there was this big artwork. So you see the arc with the nkisi, with the nails that Kendell has covered with the white and red plastic band. It was a huge cross, a Christ in cross, huge, all put in plastic, and around it like some black tart that had a sort of a vaginal shape like that, with "In God Wet Rust," and everybody. So it was very funny for me, because I took the lady like that. I said, "Do you like this?" And she went. With all the Spaniards started to try to steer away from that, because they felt very uncomfortable to this thing. And the wall next to us was actually the fuck wall. So basically, we have it everywhere. It's a little bit like Believe, but it's written in subversive fuck, and it looks like a nice tribal comforty thing. And physically, I could see all the people in the room looking at the Christ, getting away, and she said, "I like this, it's nice." And everybody started steering to the fuck wall, which I thought was so amazing, because he managed to trick us. It was such a moment for me of happiness. I found it so funny. I was like by myself laughing at everybody's reaction. And this is what I like about the show here, is that the show itself is an art proposal, is the way, and it raises questions about how artistic proposals interfere in our society, in our lives. Does it have to be in a museum? It also raises questions about collectionism. Does collecting make sense as an abundance of objects put next one to another? All these questions are raised in a very relevant and very elegant way, because he's an artist, he's a smart artist, he's an African artist, he's a guy who paid the price to be African. He was almost harassed by some black women who accused him of being responsible of being white and a man. And unfortunately, I wasn't there to defend him. But what I told everybody afterwards, I said, if anybody deserves to say something, has owned a right, it's exactly like in Angola. where I live, you have a lot of white Angolans. But the particularity about Angola is that it has determined itself through a recent history made of war. It is the country in Africa where the Cold War has been really a hard, very brutal war against racist South Africa, and then a civil war, but fueled by other influences. And you have their general, like 3 stars, who are as black as my mother, like white people. Nobody would dare question their Africanity because they know there were 4 brothers, 3 died in the war, and then the other guy is a general who made it, we don't even know how. So it's exactly the same thing with Kendell, and I think this is why I'm really, really, really happy about the show, because it was so, Kendell tried to convince me of so many things, and I was hesitant, and I thank you for trusting our friendship enough to put it through so much tension that you literally gave me shit so many times by saying, Sindika, this is not acceptable, we need to do this, it needs to be done like that, we need to try that. I said, Kendell, are you sure? It is risky, it's not going to work, I don't understand how it's going to make sense. And then at some point, when I visited the show, I showed it to my kids today, and I went with my children, and I was really happy because they were in the middle of an artwork. It was a moment of celebration, of artistic celebration. And I love you for this, and I thank you for this as a friend and a brother.
Bravo.
So we are out of time, but he's been dying to ask a question. No.
No, I'm not gonna.
No, you can ask your question, but you have to answer the question in 1 sentence.
You won't be able to. All I can say is, Kendell, you invited me to come and speak from the floor, and my contribution should be longer, but we don't have time for it. But I will say very briefly, what I'm experiencing in terms of philosophy is what I will call finding a voice, which I've felt has always been the struggle for Africans or people from outside of Europe, operating as artists, as historians, as writers, is about finding a voice. And this exhibition for me is very much about finding a voice, because I think the thing we fear most is the lack of voice, a denial of voice. And what we have learned over a very long struggle of over 100 years is to try and get a voice to create what I would call a liberated space where that voice can speak. And this exhibition is one of those liberated spaces where the voice can speak. But so much of what we've discussed in the last hour has been about not our voice, but about how others perceive that voice. We are asking, why is Smooth at MOMA? Why? What? This is, for me, is a ridiculous question, but it has to do with this empowerment you get when you have a voice and you have a liberated space in which you can conduct the conversation the way you want it, not as others perceive how the conversation should be conducted. So my question was going to be to you, if we all believe that Africans have a quality and an ability to do anything as much as any other human being, but we constantly talk about embodiment in an artwork, what happens when an artist's work, an African artist's work, is not about that embodiment? What happens when there is no narrative? What happens when there is no definable subject or recognizable subject? What happens when an African artist makes a work of art that is non-subjective or non-figurative? Where would we place that work, and how would we want the world to perceive that? That's my question.
1 sentence.
Impossible.
I mean, for me, it's an easy question to answer, because indeed, I mean, one of the issues is to learn to decolonize our mind, stop apologizing, reaffirm our identity, be African, be strong, but also, and I insist to say, this is a proposal. It's not the first, nor is it the last word. It's one proposal for a continent, and I'll say it again, like a cliche, of 54 countries and 2,000 living languages. There's a lot of space for a lot of things. We cannot generalize, and we certainly cannot reduce Africa to embodiment.
Exactly. It's my fear that what I'm seeing is a lot of work that relates to readable subjects, readable things that we already recognize, yet the beauty of the experience of the Portuguese who call these things fetish was about discovering things they do not recognize. I mean, Africans make work that you do not recognize, which is the perceived view that an African does not indulge in non-figurative work. When an African does that, that's the same Menkisi experience one more time. The only difference is, do we have a voice now to deal with that within the institutions of the art world?
And Smooth?
Yeah, but what I'll say to that is what I said earlier on, which is why I have a tension with the idea of positing spirit. You know, I said people try to make sense of their reality, and you make sense of your reality in different ways. And so the sense of abstraction, of understanding reality conceptually is something that I think is very important, you know, and which is at the heart of your question. So if we move away from the figurative, how other ways can people understand Africa? It's a valid question. And it's something I said, you know, that we should begin to elevate our conversation to move away beyond the tropes, you know. The tropes are necessary, but we can get beyond that. We can think about, even when you consider the tropes, the idea of the spirit, in what other ways might we imagine the spirit theoretically, conceptually? Because that elevates the conversation. And you don't have to answer to anyone.
With that, thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you for being here. Kendell, Ugochukwu-Smooth, thank you all so much for your insight. And if you have any follow-on questions, we'll be sure to answer them offline. Thank you.